Hi everyone and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today we're going to be tackling one of the biggest questions for watercolour beginners, so that is, how much water should I be using in my painting? So it's one of the most common questions that I get asked, and the truth is the answer is it depends. And I'm really sorry, but what we're going to do in this video is talk through some of the different scenarios and why we use water, and then we're going to look at some troubleshooting for, having not enough water or too much water on your brush. And some of the effects that it can have so that you can work out what's right for your brush, your paper, the effects that you're trying to make, and the paints that you're using as well. So let's get started. So it's worth starting with an explanation of why water is so important in watercolour. So if we look here, what I'm using is 2 water cups. Now the reason for that is that water is essentially the vehicle for watercolour. So watercolour is a water-soluble paint, so it means that the pigments are all dissolving in the water. So they're quite dry when you start with them, and then as you add water, they get activated, and that's what makes the paint flow. And then you paint it on your paper or whatever you're painting on, and then the water evaporates, and what's left behind is the paint. So the water is acting like a vehicle to get the actual paint onto your paper, mix it together, create whatever effects you want, and then it dries, and as you can see, it leaves behind the paint, and there's all of the water has evaporated. So that's why, because the water is carrying the paint and helping to mix it and blend it, that's why it's so important to have clean water. So you'll see a lot of watercolour artists use 2 cups. So this is the system I use. I have a warm cup and a cool cup. So this is for warm colours like my oranges and my reds, and this is for cool colours like my greens and my blues and my kind of bluish purple tones. So this stops them getting all mixed together, because when you mix warm and cool, then you get a kind of muddy brown colour. And if you have dirty water, then you will get dirty, muddy watercolour paints when you try and mix them. If that system doesn't work for you, some artists prefer to have a dirty cup and a clean cup. So they have a cup for washing off the brush with the colours, and then they have a clean cup where they pick up clean water and mix their colours again. Whatever system works for you, but if you see your water getting kind of thick or dirty, then just change it and make sure that it's kept clean. The other thing that water does for us is mix up the value of the colour. So essentially we add water to dilute the colours. So if we take this green here and we get a very thick mixture with not very much water and a lot of paint on our brushes, then we get a very dark colour. But if we add more water, we then get much lighter colours until we're working with a very light value. So this change from kind of dark to light by adding water is value. And so what you can see here is that the different amounts of water are going to give us different colours and tones. So it's not a case of, the more water you add to a mixture, then it'll be too wet. Sometimes if you keep adding water, you just simply get a much lighter value. But it's still the right consistency of paint. It's not too much water. Okay, so we've talked about value and why we need clean water. So what do people mean when they ask if we have too much or not enough water? So the best way to think of this is to troubleshoot. So for example, if we have a very dry brush, so you can see I've just blotted it on my towel there and it looks very dry, and you can kind of push it around and it stays in where you've poked it. And then you pick up some very dry paint, so straight off the pan, what you're going to get, you can see how sometimes the bristles are sticking out as well, and what you're going to get is a rough line with gaps in it, like that. So this is, when your brush is very dry and your paint mixture is very dry, this is not enough water. Now you can use dry brush for nice effects, but generally if you're painting and your lines are very quickly getting gappy on the texture of the paper, then you don't have enough water. So a little bit more water mixed into that would then create a more smooth line. And although you will get some gaps, especially this paper is quite a rough texture, but it's not completely gappy and kind of your brush is dragging on the paper. It's just a few gaps here and there. On the other hand, if you have your brush completely dripping with water, you'll know first of all because you're likely to drip on your paper. But then when you press it down and drag, you get a puddle. So what you have is a big lump of water at the start there. So that's a sign that you've got too much water on your brush when it's, pulling and pooling. And what this creates is an imbalance of water through your strokes. So you have, say, a lot of water here and then not very much here, and the same here. This is a big puddle. So you often get puddles at the beginning of strokes. When you put your brush down, you get a puddle and then you drag it and it clears up. Or sometimes you can get them at the end of strokes. So if I mix some more colour there so you can see it, then you press, and when you lift up, then you leave behind a puddle at the end of your stroke. Now, those puddles, what they do is, because there's an imbalance of water, what's going to happen is that the area with not too much water is going to dry faster than the area with a lot of water. And what happens then is that you get these things, which are called hard edges. So you can see here where this part of the shape dried first and then this part dried second. And what happens is that because this is a puddle, where this shape is dried, then the puddle kind of pushes into the dry bit and it creates this kind of edge where the pigment is kind of going from wet to dry and kind of meeting and making almost like a little bridge. So this is where, there's been an imbalance of water. Now, if you see any puddles, it's easiest to pick them up with a dry brush or a piece of cloth, or you can smooth them back through your shape to make sure that the water content is more even, and that will stop these hard edges. I really recommend trying to fix them as you go along, because if you dry like that, it's really difficult then to fix this. You end up having to kind of re-wet the whole shape and kind of smush it about and try and get through the line, and it's not always successful. So yeah, if you've got lots of puddles, you pick them up with dry brush, as I've said, kind of smush it around the shape. You can also use a piece of kitchen towel or a cloth just to pick it up and make sure that you're catching those puddles. If you struggle to see them, you can always let me put a few more puddle strokes down so you can see. If you've got an area with, say, a lot of water, one of the things you can do is slightly tilt your paper, because you will see it move. And that will tell you there's too much water, so then you can pick that up as well. We pick all of that excess up. So we've got too dry and too wet, so the right amount of water, then it should be a nice kind of smooth look on your brush, and you should have a good stroke with some kind of gaps as you keep going, but the first bit at least is, very clear, and you don't have any kind of puddles or blobs where you're leaving lots of water behind. And then you just add more water or more paint to change the value, and you can still get really good clean strokes without, as I say, those puddles. It's also important when we talk about hard edges that we don't necessarily consider these a mistake, and the same with the dry brush technique. It's not necessarily a mistake or a problem. Some artists use these with great creative effect, and I know that if I get them in my work, I don't consider them mistakes. They're just nice, interesting features in the watercolour. So, by all means, make sure you pick up puddles and try and control the water, but don't worry if you get hard edges. It's not a sign of a bad painting or a mistake. And I promise you that other people looking at your painting, they don't see the lines like this. They just appreciate the whole. So you're far more critical of your work than anyone else will be. Now, one last thing to talk about is what else might affect the amount of water that you need. So you've got your value, but it could also be affected by things like your brush size. If you've got a very big brush or a very small brush, you'll need very different amounts of water on them. Small brushes only need a tiny bit of water, or they can very quickly make puddles. But big brushes can absorb a lot of water and hold a lot more water, and then they make longer strokes without getting gappy. So you can see there on a little brush, it gets gappy much more quickly. Likewise, your paper has an impact. So this is part cotton paper, and it's a very rough texture, so it can hold and handle a lot of water. But if you're using something like this, which is a hot press paper, then the same amount of water is more likely to make puddles on this, because it is just so much smoother. So the water sits on the surface instead of going into the texture of the paper. So you're much more likely to get hard edges with hot press paper, especially if you're using a lot of water. So you have to be really mindful of the puddles and the way that you can see the water moving. That tells you it's too much. So paper can have an impact, brushes can have an impact, and then also your paints as well. If you're working from, dry pans, or this is tube paint that I've simply dried out. So that needs a lot more water to reactivate it. But if you're using, tubes, paint straight from the tubes, or if you're using liquid watercolors or inks, that needs a lot less water because it's already in a more liquid form. So those are all of the other things that can have an impact. But I hope that this guide and doing some kind of practices with your own brushes and colours will be able to show you how much water you need to get really smooth and, finessed effects in your watercolour painting. Okay, so there we are. That's all of my tips. So I hope this video has been really useful for you and that you've been able to work out, a bit more about how to use water to change up the value and some signs for when you're having too much or not enough water. So I hope this was helpful and please let me know in the comments what you want to do next. See you in the next one.